If we think back to maybe the WannaCry attack, critical exploit that exploited a critical vulnerability, and it was able to quickly jump from a user opening a malicious file to taking out an entire network. Whereas, these days attacks tend to include multiple stages and they have to chain multiple vulnerabilities and weaknesses and overprivileges and misconfigurations together to perform the attack. So I think overall, we're in a better place after a decade.
You're listening to KBKast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is James Maude, lead cybersecurity researcher at BeyondTrust, and today we're discussing the recent release of Microsoft Vulnerabilities report. We'll be linking a copy of the report if you want to do a bit of a deeper dive after our interview with James today. So, James, thanks for joining and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So, I want to start with the Microsoft Vulnerabilities report. Now, it's the 10th year this year, which, well done. That's a very long-standing report that you've had specifically about Microsoft Vulnerabilities. So maybe talk to me a little bit about this report and how did this sort of come about for people who maybe aren't familiar with your report?
Yeah, sure. So although it's called the Microsoft Vulnerabilities Report, it isn't written by Microsoft. It's currently published by BeyondTrust, the company I work for. And it actually started off life at one of the previous companies, Avecto, which is now part of BeyondTrust. And what Avecto did was they specialized in endpoint privilege management. At the time, heavily focused on the Windows OS. And they spent a lot of time trying to educate people around the concepts of least privilege and why it was so important to remove local administrator rights from users. And at the time, a lot of organizations had a lot of overprivileged users. They knew it was risky, but they didn't really grasp how risky it was. And then one of the product managers at the time, a very smart guy called Chris Zentek, realized that Microsoft were putting out these security bulletins every month for Patch Tuesday, which is the second Tuesday of every month where they push out all the latest patches to address the security vulnerabilities. And they often included this line which said something along the lines of, users whose accounts are configured to have fewer user rights on the system could be less impacted than users who operate with administrator rights. And suddenly there was this light bulb moment, because this was exactly the point that Avecto and many others in the industry had been making, that if a user with administrator privileges is exploited or runs malicious code, it has a far greater impact and risk than if they were a standard user. But now with the Microsoft vulnerabilities that they were publishing in these bulletins, they had a way to kind of quantify that and say, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that Microsoft say would be less severe, that would be mitigated if you didn't have administrator rights as that user. So not only handily did Microsoft publish this data, but they published it in a CSV format. So it was really easy for us to get hold of it. Chris handed the project over to his brother Andy, who worked in the marketing team at the time. And he pulled together the first report, which tracked which vulnerabilities could be mitigated by removing admin rights. And the results actually were surprising even for the company who dealt with admin rights all the time, because when they started looking at it at the time, 92% of the critical vulnerabilities, so the vulnerabilities that keep IT folks awake at night, could actually have been mitigated by removing admin rights. And then as they drilled into the other data, they found 100% of all the Internet Explorer vulnerabilities, 100% of remote code execution vulnerabilities, and 91% of the Office vulnerabilities could also be mitigated. So suddenly they realized there was this great data source they could do, put this together in a report, and people really liked reading it. And suddenly when we published that first report, the impact of removing admin privileges as a really proactive way to reduce your security became very apparent for a lot of people. Quickly became the company's most downloaded asset. It got a good amount of coverage in the press and analysts who started quoting it on slide decks. But more importantly, it gave a lot of people out there a tool to have a conversation in their organization about least privilege, about why it was so important to remove those excessive privileges and spend some time looking at this. And it's been published every year since. It's received thousands of downloads now and gives a really good insight into how the threats and software has evolved over the past decade. And actually, on a personal note, it's the reason I ended up working in this industry, because I joined Avecto the year after that first report was published. And they approached me about coming in as a researcher. I was working in the university at the time. And I read that report and thought, oh, wow, this actually does make a difference. This is a really cool thing to be working on in the cybersecurity area. And I exited my career as an academic researcher and came into industry because of it.
Wow. Well, that's pretty cool. So you've read the report's inception, so the last 10 years. So you're quite across it to a comprehensive level then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I've been dipping in and out of it. So I was involved with it. I didn't do the first one. I was involved in several after that. I did leave the company briefly, went off and did some other things, but came back just over 2 years ago now as the companies had all come together. picked up where I left off with it. But yeah, it's had a few caretakers over the years. And the nice thing as well is it attracts a lot of expert commentary. So we have a lot of Microsoft MVPs and security professionals who like to come on and give commentary on the report every year and give their insights. So there's a kind of team of people who've been getting it out there for the past 10 years.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that I'm curious to know about. So the last 10 years, is there anything that sort of sticks out that has been quite of a shift that you could sort of share with the audience today?
The vulnerabilities have increased rapidly, right? We've had a huge increase in vulnerability numbers over the years, and that's probably not really a surprise to most people. Microsoft have vastly increased the amount of software they offer. If you think about 10 years ago, Windows 8 had just come out, Microsoft Edge didn't exist, most of the cloud offerings that we're using today didn't exist. So actually, as the products have become more prevalent, there's a lot more out there's a lot more customers, we can see that the number of vulnerabilities has gone up. And actually in the report, interestingly, we chart it against Microsoft's global revenue. And you can see that the increase in vulnerabilities matches the curve almost perfectly for their increase in revenue, with the exception of 2020, actually, which was an interesting year because suddenly everyone had more to do at home. We had global lockdowns and things like that. So people were focusing on just playing around with the products more. And suddenly there was a spike in vulnerabilities. But what's interesting over that 10 years is although the numbers of vulnerabilities overall has increased significantly, the number of critical vulnerabilities, those ones I mentioned earlier where they keep the IT staff awake at night worrying about getting these patches out there, they've actually decreased. So what we've seen is Microsoft are seeing more vulnerabilities, but most of them are far less severe than they used to be. And this is kind of a reflection of the focus that Microsoft have been putting on hardening their products. That secure computing memo that Bill Gates wrote 20 years ago seems to have sort of kicked in over time. There's been a slow turnaround in Microsoft, and they've really started to embrace, doing security first, architecting things in a very secure way. And the shift in operating systems from, Windows XP that we were looking at 10 years ago to Windows 10 and 11 now, there's been significant leaps forward in the security architecture there that have really made a difference and made people less vulnerable to some of the critical exploits that are out there.
So just to reiterate, so from my understanding, it's a 650% increase over the last decade in terms of the vulnerabilities that have increased. But what you're saying is the critical vulnerabilities have decreased.
Absolutely. So in the 2013 report, there was 333 total vulnerabilities. Of those, 147 were critical. So about 44% of all vulnerabilities were the highly dangerous critical ones. Then we fast forward to 2023. We've now got 1,292 vulnerabilities, but only 89 were critical, so 7%. So that's a really positive sign that lessons are being learned. And we can see this in practice, when we look at the security architecture that are out there, the exploits and the attacks that are out there, they're not able to do the things, if we think back to maybe the WannaCry attack, there's a big thing over here in the UK, hit the NHS, the ransomware, and that used critical exploit that exploited a critical vulnerability, and it was able to quickly jump from a user opening a malicious file to taking out an entire network. Whereas, these days attacks tend to include multiple stages and they have to chain multiple vulnerabilities and weaknesses and overprivileges and misconfigurations together to perform the attack. So I think overall, we're in a better place after a decade.
So just going back for a second, you mentioned, James, that Microsoft commentators come in and sort of speak about the report. What's some of the commentary? Are they sort of like, yeah, okay, we know what's sort of happening, but I think they've probably been a little bit more, or what you're saying is they're more open with that they're addressing it rather than not trying to say anything against your report?
It's kind of like marking Microsoft's homework, really, that we're just looking at the sum total of the things that they've done in terms of the vulnerabilities that have been discovered, the patches that have gone out over the year. And we've got, people your region, the infamous Troy Hunt, we've got who's a Microsoft regional director and MVP there, and just talking about why patching is important, why least privilege is important, and how Microsoft are doing, in improving their security and taking things seriously, and what the trends are in there. We see shifting trends in the different vulnerability classes that are out there as well. So we see things like remote code execution have always been common because attackers ultimately want to be able to execute code. So there's a lot of focus on that area. But things like elevation of privilege attacks have really shot up in the last few years. So people picking apart why that's the case and just drilling into this. It's kind of it's not really passing judgment on Microsoft as such. It's just really saying this is where we're at as an industry. This is what the trends are telling us. This is the direction that we're seeing, the security landscape going in.
Yeah, sure. I can definitely understand that. So I'm curious then to know, and you are right, no one's judging. Would you say that other vendors out there, if the same sort of report was written Would you say they'd be less open to that? Would they feel judged?
I don't know. It depends how you do these things. Amusingly, over the years, quite a number of competitors and other vendors actually just quote our report directly and in some cases link directly to it, which has probably caused the vast number of downloads that we've had over the years. So, people are making use of the report we're publishing directly. Sometimes out there, people can be a bit adversarial because if you look at some of the research companies that are focused on actually finding these vulnerabilities and, doing red teaming, they can kick up a bit more of a fuss and take a bit more of an adversarial nature with these things because they're trying to raise their profile as the people who know where all the bodies are buried in the operating system. They know where all the vulnerabilities are that can be exploited, and they can be quite critical. Whereas we're not saying, taking judgment on it as such. We're just saying this is the direction things are going in. And actually, there's these fundamental things that are at the core of your security program around making sure you've implemented least privilege properly and making sure you're patching. And then this is the justification for you to talk to your business about why those things are so important.
So I'm curious then to know, you speak a lot about like patching, Patch Tuesdays.
Yeah.
Now, I've spoken a lot about this on the show. Patch management, though, still people struggle with that after 20 years. So what's your thoughts on it?
Patch management's a really interesting one. So I think when this report started, there's a bit of a bad reputation Microsoft had. And a lot of vendors had actually around patching because people felt that a patch would come out and nobody wanted to be the early adopters of it. Everyone was fearful that it would, cause issues and break systems. And they'd had like a lot of quality issues where they'd push a patch out and, it caused stability issues. So everyone was like, well, we'll wait for everyone else to try it and then we'll jump on it later. But if you look at the things that are out there, the Australian Department of Defence Essential 8, the SANS Critical Controls, the NCSC guidance in the UK, there's a reason that patching is one of the number one things you can do. Most people think, well, firewalls and antivirus and EDR solutions are the most important things. But actually, if you look at the research and the evidence, taking away administrator rights, patching your operating system, patching your software that's installed on there, if you can manage it, application block listing as well, those, have been shown to mitigate around 80% of all attacks that are out there. So they're critically important. So, sometimes people say it's hard to do and it's difficult, but often it's because maybe they don't know where all their assets are or they just don't have a system in place. And it can be painful to do, but in terms of the, investment and the opportunity for improving your security, it's huge. And at the end of the day, you can invest huge amounts of money in other security tooling. You can get, SIEM solutions and reporting solutions and all this great stuff. And it costs you a lot of money and you hire a lot of resources to manage it. But actually, it doesn't deliver you the same benefits as, least privilege, patching, and just covering those basics to get rid of those exploits. Because if you've patched something, it can't easily be exploited. If it isn't patched or there's a 0-day out there, well, least privilege is a good defense because it means that, if the attacker does get to run code, it's going to run with the least access, the least privileges possible. So it's a really good proactive security stance and that old sort of stitch in time saves 9 kind of thing.
That was the operative word. I was waiting for that. It's the basics. Okay, I'm really curious then to get into this because a lot of people that I speak to, they always say, it's about the basics, KB. But then it's like, yeah, I get that. But like basics aren't basic. Because again, going back to patch management, what you say makes sense. Yet people don't do that. They struggle. It's hard. I can't do it. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what my assets are. I couldn't be bothered. I hear a lot of that. So what's your response to that? Because everyone's just like, oh, it's about doing the basics and we can't do the basics right. And then you made a great point, but we'll spend other money on SIEMs and WAFs and all these other things. So then it's like, well, why does everyone keep coming out here and saying it's about the basics, but a lot of people still can't manage to do that?
There's a few things there to unpick. So actually, I don't tend to talk about it as the basics. I tend to talk about it as the foundation, because if you don't have that solid foundation to build your program on, you're going to undermine your own investment. That, so one of the games I like to play is I like to read, and this is quite sad that I play this game, but when I'm reading news stories like over my coffee in the morning, and you see these stories about big breaches that are out there, and this company was attacked, and it was this nation state or this APT, and it was a very sophisticated attack, and you start to read it, and you'd think that it was completely unstoppable, right? But then you start to read into the details, and this is the game I play, where I start to read it, and it says, oh, they exploited a vulnerability in this system, or this known exploit, or this CVE, whatever it is, 2022 was used against the company. So you're thinking immediately, well, that means that something wasn't patched somewhere, so that was preventable. And then you see this other part of it where it's talking about the attackers are able to dump credentials using a tool like Mimikatz, or they've disabled the AV or EDR solution on the endpoint to avoid detection. And I'm thinking, okay, those require privileges. As a standard user, you can't do that. So immediately I'm seeing these big breaches that are out there. And so many times I'm just looking at it going, okay, if user whose account was compromised or password was stolen or they were phished or whatever it was, hadn't had the level of privilege they had there, if those systems that they could connect to from that endpoint had been patched, then the attacker would have really been put in a box and had to start thinking of some more advanced things there. So often these attacks can be stopped. So that's why I talk about it as the foundation of building your security program, because you could invest in some great detection solution that, collects all these event logs. But if the attacker is able to use an exploit to get code running, use the user's privileges to disable the local event logging, then you're not going to see those events in your very expensive security solution. You're going to be blinded to it. So that's why I talk about it being that foundational layer. And actually, it's about thinking of, some of the things that people talk about. Well, I can't do patch management because, maybe I don't know where all my assets are. I don't have a good inventory. Well, that's the foundation of, a cybersecurity program. If you don't know what all your assets are, how can you hope to protect them? So, it's about doing these things in kind of the logical order and, putting the effort in where it's needed. I think one of the traps we've fallen into as an industry, and you probably come across this all the time, is the hype. We're really excited about selling next gen AI powered super duper detection, all these kind of things with flashing graph boards and what kind of war games diagrams of, attackers flying through cyberspace and all that kind of thing. And that's all very exciting. And there's a lot of marketing budget and effort that goes into marketing that as the best solution and the one box you need to buy to fix all your problems. But actually, a lot of the time, it does take a bit of legwork to get these things in place, perhaps. But cost-wise, they're relatively low cost of getting, patch management and getting least privilege in place. They might not always be the easiest thing, but the legwork you're doing there sets the foundations for the rest of your program and makes you far more successful in the long term.
Yeah, I like the way you said, get away from saying basics, because so many people on the show have said, it's about basics. I'm like, yeah, but now that you've said, let's traverse into saying foundations, I think makes a bit more sense.
Yeah. Microsoft actually put out many years ago now a thing called the hierarchy of cyber needs based on kind of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
And they had this wonderful diagram where it was kind of like at the bottom, you need control. You need to know what the devices are. Then you need control of the software that's running on them, then the access. And then at the very top of the pyramid is detection. The problem is, as an industry, we tend to run towards we want to detect all the things instead of proactively preventing all the things. So, if you don't have all those controls, it's the same thing. I always used to joke that if you're a government employee, you can have the best AV, the best security tooling on your laptop. But if that hard drive of that laptop isn't BitLocked or encrypted and you leave that on a train somewhere, then an attacker is going to be able to access that data. So that foundational thing of securing devices, securing access and software is a really important step to take.
So let's stay with the example in the Maslow hierarchy of needs. I literally used that as a question in an interview the other day, so I really like that. So you made great points, but why are people so focused on let's run before we can sort of walk here? If you want to go back to that example, why is that the case? Because what you're saying does make sense, seems logical, it seems cheaper, it seems a lot easier to do, but yet people are very focused on, okay, let's run and do all these other crazy things first. Where do you think that stems from in terms of the behavior?
It's an interesting one. So people are sometimes a little bit blind to the issues they have. One of the challenges we've had over the years with talking about least privilege and privilege access management is you go to an organization and they say, okay, we don't have any users with local admin rights. And they start talking to them and they go, well, accept the guys in IT. I would accept those engineers over there. So you kind of become blind to your own environment a little bit and you start to buy into the fact that you think you're okay. And there's that system over there, we haven't patched it, but it's never caused us a problem. And the challenge with a lot of things, so if you have deficiencies in your software, so say like Salesforce or whatever software you're using, it's causing issues and there's technical debt there, you're going to have a lot of users shouting at you. You're going to have people calling up the help desk saying, I can't generate this report, I can't click this thing, I can't do that. The problem with security debt is silent. Nobody ever complains that they were able to uninstall the software, that they were able to install the software they wanted, that they were able to download the email attachment that they got sent. No one ever complains about those things because they can just get on and do their job. They complain when the proverbial hits the fan and everything goes wrong in the organization and suddenly all that debt is exposed. So security debt is silent debt a lot of the time. And organizations, don't tend to prioritize these things until they've got impacted by a breach. And sadly, most organizations at this point now have been impacted, whether they know it or not, perhaps as well. So that's kind of one of the challenges there. The other one is skill shortage, right? We have a limited number of people with security chops in the world, global shortage of them. So people really want to try and work as efficiently as possible. And they might feel that going out and, doing an inventory or maintaining these things or having spreadsheets or trying to work out what privileges and access users need is a task that's going to take them too long. And what they'd rather do is buy the box with the blinking lights from the vendor that says, you're going to have one pane of glass and it's going to solve all your problems. So a lot of the industry and hype is geared up around kind of buy this one tool, it solves all your problems. It stops ransomware, it stops phishing, it stops all these other things. And it's kind of a nice sell to talk about. But again, like we talked about, that those breaches we see in the news where the security software on the endpoints was disabled and the attacker was able to move around. You're not going to be able to stop those attacks, even with those kind of one box solutions. It's that defense in depth approach. And I think just trying to shift people's mindsets away from the reactive detect all the threats thing, which is a lot of the kind of portrayal in the news and things is you need to detect these things. You need to detect these advanced attacks. Well, actually, you need to prevent them really. And you need to shift to a balance of proactive and reactive controls together. Detection isn't dead, neither is prevention. The two need to work together.
So I just want to go back to your comment around security debt. So would you say this just goes by the wayside because people have got 1,001 other things to do? Do you think then when this comes up, like you mentioned before, around breaches and stuff, this really blindsides people? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, you can think of the kind of day-to-day role of someone in the security team, and they're probably just firefighting a lot of the time. They're responding to, this user's clicked this phishing email, this person's seen this thing they think is suspicious, users run some malicious code or some unwanted software on this endpoint. So you're constantly running around firefighting and things like that. So you're probably reacting to those things and not having the time or the focus to step back and say, okay, bigger picture of those 100 incidents I've dealt with in the past week, how many would have been resolved if I'd, been able to have more robust patching, if I'd had users with fewer privileges, if I'd been able to control the applications that they can execute on those endpoints. So it's sometimes about, stepping out of that kind of very focused, just responding and firefighting thing to, okay, bigger picture, what's the big picture here? What could we do to take out an entire class of attacks that are regularly happening against our organization or entire class of tickets that we're seeing raised in the help desk? And it's about being able to tell the stories of why that's a risk. And I think that's why this report is quite useful because it provides people with a tool to go to business and say, look, this is how effective least privilege is against all these vulnerabilities that are out there. Yes, we should be patching them, but we don't always get around to it. So if we at least start to think about least privilege, we can reduce our risk there significantly against not only the known vulnerabilities, but future ones as well. This is a timeless concept of least privilege. I mean, I keep talking about least privilege as if it's a new thing, and I think it was originally defined by the Department of Defense in 1985 in the Rainbow Book. So, these aren't new things we're talking about. These are timeless concepts in security that we know are very effective. We just need to be able to tell the story to the business. So as well as the shortage of security professionals, we have a shortage of people who can tell the security stories to the business that resonate with them, that make the board think, okay, yeah, I understand the risk now. I want to prioritize this.
Yeah, so true. It's a downward spiral then at times. So let's go back to the report. Were there any sort of key highlights or any sort of key insights you'd like to sort of share with the audience today, James?
Sure. So I think one of them was the fact that we mentioned already that critical vulnerabilities are decreasing. This is an interesting one, and this kind of ties in with why overall vulnerabilities are increasing, because as an attacker, if you can't just do that, run one exploit, exploit one vulnerability and take over the entire network, then you're going to have to start chaining things together, which is one of the reasons we're seeing an increase in the number of overall vulnerabilities. Some of the other interesting things in the report, we're seeing Microsoft Office is significantly improving. That's been a real headache for a lot of organizations. We've all seen the phishing emails, the malicious macros, all those kind of things. And they're not only improving Office from a code security and vulnerability hardening perspective, but they're also improving a lot of the defaults for letting macros downloaded from the internet run. They're blocking that by default now. So they're improving a lot of the configuration by default as well there, which is a really good thing. But it's not all been brilliant there. There's been some rocky steps. They've had to roll things back when they've kind of gone wrong there with blocking the macros. And they've had a few issues with, there was a vulnerability called Folina and one called Dogwalk, which were reported to them by security researchers initially and were dismissed because the guys at Microsoft, or guys and girls, thought that actually this isn't really a security vulnerability. It's just the software working in the way it's intended to. But it still led to an attacker being able to execute code. And the reason for that was there were some applications that were linked into Office that could be called by an Office macro or an Office function. There were actually legacy things that have been kicking around in the operating system for a long time that were working as intended, but actually no one had ever thought that they could be used in this malicious way. So it took Microsoft a little while to come around to that. And it wasn't until actually these were being exploited actively by threat actors in the wild that they suddenly realized, okay, this is actually a vulnerability. We shouldn't just dismiss this and we should deal with this. So that's been a bit of a mixed bag there on the Office front. And that leads us on to another area, which is, that technical debt, which we've mentioned in organizations, exists in Microsoft. If you think about the operating system, the Windows OS today, it's been built on previous versions. The NT kernel has evolved over the years, and we've just kept building on top of it, which means we've got some bits of code, even in Windows 10 and 11, like the print spooler code, which are 20 plus years old now. And we saw in 2021, Print Nightmare come out, this quite dangerous exploit that was out there. But it wasn't alone. We saw around 16 vulnerabilities in the print spooler that year. We've seen over 35 in 2022. So what we're seeing is attackers finding these kind of areas of code that have maybe been forgotten about in the sands of time and starting to really probe into those and finding that these can be quite a big target for exploit writers and vulnerability researchers. And Microsoft have been playing this game of whack-a-mole, trying to patch all these legacy issues. And these are things that, vendors like Apple have less challenges with because they're quicker at updating things and they're quicker at re-architecting the entire OS. Microsoft have a lot of baggage with them that have been built up over the years. And we can see this now with them. They're trying to support ARM chipsets. It's a difficulty because the core OS can support it, but then they need all the drivers and things to support it as well. So that technical debt and that long tail of technical features that they built up over the years is holding them back a little in improving security, but we are moving in kind of the right area there. And I think fundamentally the key takeaway from the report is that actually doing least privilege, removing administrator rights where possible, and patching as much as possible, trying to keep up to date on these things is just hugely important. Those are, like I said, the foundations that you can build on. And the report over the last 10 years really has highlighted how important that is.
So I just have to ask then as well, are they going to bring a new version of Clippy 2.0 out?
I'm hoping this is what AI is going to bring us. People talk about AI being scary, but all I want is Clippy and the wizard to come back, really.
That's all I think about. I wouldn't mind Clippy coming back. To be honest, I haven't used a Windows machine for a very long time. I'm all Apple, Mac. So yeah, even now when I get on a Windows machine, I'm like, wow, I have to even force myself on how to use it because it's been so long.
Yeah, well, there's obviously, people thought Apple was going to take over the world, but in terms of the enterprise, Windows still dominates, really.
Sure.
I think they're getting there. There's a lot more useful features, a lot of things that are integrated. And obviously the boom of the, Office 365 and the cloud and people adopting Teams and things like that has really started pushing their innovation forward. And of course, they've got the new AI capabilities. And we actually do have a section in the report talking, kind of speculating about what future AI vulnerabilities might look like and how Microsoft are going to actually identify vulnerabilities in AI systems. So that's kind of an interesting thing as we look to the future.
Any sort of insights you can share on that front?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if you look at some of the things that are happening with, say, ChatGPT, where there've been lawsuits brought against it because it's provided, false information. It's scraped things from the web and come to conclusions. We actually do a podcast called The Adventures of Alice and Bob, and we had a guest on, Kate Mazuras, who actually started the Microsoft Vulnerabilities bug bounty program at Microsoft. She was telling us that it tells people that she used to be an astronaut, because in an interview once, she told them that as a child, she wanted to be an astronaut. So ChatGPT is now telling people that she actually was an astronaut. So things like that become interesting because how did that come about? How did the AI make that decision, provide that information? Who's responsible for that? Where's the vulnerability? Is it in the algorithm? Is it in the data set? Is it in the question that the user asked? How can you tell when AI is being exploited or vulnerable when you don't necessarily understand how it came to a conclusion because it's some very complex neural network of things? And AI vulnerabilities are obviously very different to traditional bugs in code where you can point to a line of code that caused it and fix it because AI is training itself on data sets. It's just fundamentally different. So it's going to lead to a different class of vulnerabilities and exploits, we think, in the future.
Yeah, that's such a great point. How's it going to be addressed?
Well, we don't really know yet. It's interesting. We're starting to see some of the challenges coming up around this. If you think about some of the things, like smarter cars are doing now with self-driving, who is actually responsible if that car gets in an accident? Is it the driver who was sat in the car? Is it the person who manufactures the car? Is it the person who coded the software that, drives the AI system? Is it the camera that is interpreting signals and passing them on to the neural network? There's all these kind of things of who's actually responsible for these things. So it's going to be really hard to actually pin down how these things can be addressed. And I think we just have to make sure that we're putting safeguards in place to make sure we are, maybe taking these things with a pinch of salt and building a degree of confidence in them and pushing as much as possible for transparency. We've seen the challenges of machine learning algorithms doing credit ratings, taking human biases and spreading those out into automation. So, for example, women are often given lower credit scores than men when applying for credit cards because they've been trained on the biased data sets that have existed in the past. So I think we've just got to be really careful as we start to look at those things.
Well, I guess, a lot of people I've been speaking to on the show, James, the same as when it comes to ChatGPT and AI, for example, we're just in uncharted territory. Well, number one, would you agree? But then as we traverse into the next even 6-12 months, new versions of ChatGPT is rolling out. What do you think we're in for? Or it's too hard to tell? I know you're not the wizard from, from Office, but I'm just genuinely curious. It's just an opinion piece.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges in general with the industry is there's a lot of hype around AI. And a lot of vendors are going out there saying, we have an AI-powered system. And it isn't. It simply isn't. A lot of the time, at best, it's machine learning. At worst, it's just some, heuristics, you cross this threshold and we trigger this action thing. So there's a lot of misrepresentation of people saying things are AI when they aren't. In terms of ChatGPT and other bits, I can see for those generative AIs, I can definitely see there's going to be some really good uses. You can see in the tasks you're trying to do in Office documents. So you mentioned Clippy earlier. Now, if Clippy could help me write a very boring report and, make it more interesting, correct my spelling, rearrange it in a way that's more engaging, to me, that's actually really useful there. But at the same time, I'm worrying about where the data from that report is going, who else could potentially access it. So, there's some security boundaries, whether we should be processing things more locally, especially when we're dealing with sensitive data, what things it's learning from there. To be honest, the biggest headache I know about with AI at the moment is my wife is a school teacher and it causes no end of headaches of children just writing reports using ChatGPT. So, there are some areas that are going to be hit first. I'm not too worried about it in the security sphere. I just think it'll be interesting to see if it can be a really powerful enabler to help people, change security configurations faster, understand maybe if they don't have a hugely technical security background, why these event logs matter, being able to pass that information and highlight to a human and explain to them why some security event firing matters to them and what they should then do about it. And if we can do things like that, I think it could be really useful.
Okay, so you mentioned something before, your wife being a school teacher, students using ChatGPT, which I get. So does that then mean, if we were to zoom out, like we're just breeding a next generation of people that don't have to think or know stuff? Because when I went to school, there was none of that. There was no, you were doing computers in computer classes, but it wasn't to what's happening now. You still had to learn the stuff and write things out on pen and paper. So what are we going to now evolve to? I don't know the answer. I'll just ask ChatGPT to do it. Does that mean common sense is not going to be common, or what are we dealing with here?
Well, it's an interesting one. I think there was some research a while back that actually showed since the invention of things like Google and Bing, they're out there, that people actually aren't retaining information because their brains are being now trained that they don't need to remember things, that they can just go and look them up at the touch of a button. So we're potentially already in the state where people are remembering less and retaining less information just because your brain is very efficient and it knows it can go and find that information at the touch of a button. So why remember it? One of the interesting things I'm seeing coming through at the moment is people often talk about how the latest generation coming through are super tech savvy. They have their mobiles, they have their Snapchat and all that kind of thing. And they are all over those apps. But I think from the days when I was at school where, if you wanted a computer, you usually physically built one and you learned to solder things and you did all that kind of stuff, that people are actually losing some of those core concepts. You don't need to learn to program because you can just drag and drop things together in some sort of builder app, or you can just ask ChatGPT to write some code for you. And there's a danger there as we shift away from those kind of fundamental understandings of the kind of the physics of how computers and security works, that we'll lose sight of that. And that's like low-level technical skill we'll lose out on that means that we might not necessarily recognize security vulnerabilities that have been introduced. If you don't understand the code and you're just getting ChatGPT to write it, how do you know that ChatGPT hasn't accidentally introduced a vulnerability there because it's, scanned 100 Stack Overflow threads and just pulled someone's bad code out of there to use as the example in your code. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. But I think there is a concern that we're going to lose some of that core understanding of how things work.
Yeah, that's so true. Hey, it goes back to the foundations. I mean, look, even growing up with my grandmother, we'd play cards and she'd like count the numbers up like in her head. And I was like, not too bad at it, but like now people wouldn't do that. They're just like, oh, I've got my phone. Why would I need to have to count when I can just add them up on my phone? You don't even have a calculator anymore. I see a calculator on someone's desk. I'm like, how old school are you? Because you have your phone now. It's even that mindset, the foundations, because, she's like, oh, you got to learn how to do this yourself, like back in the day. And I'm thinking, why? When I have a phone, or you had a calculator back then. So I can start to see now as you're talking that the evolution of how the mindset has changed. And I'm definitely part of the problem here as well. I'm not saying that, not contributing to it. So I think that just as you were talking, that's what came up in my mind. And then the foundations of things. And like you mentioned before, ChatGPT, how would you know? Well, you wouldn't is the answer.
Yeah, and then do you need a second AI to correct the first AI? And it becomes a bit of a strange thing. And like I mentioned, like school kids, they write an essay using ChatGPT. So then someone releases some software that lets you scan text to work out whether it was generated, which then means that someone else goes and writes a new algorithm that generates text that can't be recognized. And you just end up with this silly kind of arms race, things playing off against each other.
Who knows? I think that, that's why I love doing the show, getting people on like yourself to share your thoughts and opinions. Like, we're not saying that everyone has all the answers, but it's about sharing the knowledge and the insights that you do have. So do you have any sort of final thoughts or any closing comments, James, you'd like to leave our audience with today?
So I'd just like to thank you for having us on the podcast today. It's been really interesting. If people want to have a look at the report, they can visit beyondtrust.com, and we've got a lot of other resources on there if they're interested in learning more about least privilege and how that can help secure their organization. And like you say, it's been a good conversation just to put some thoughts out into the world and maybe not even have answers, just ask a few questions that get people thinking.
Most definitely. And I'm definitely the right person that is always asking the questions. So thanks so much, James. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MercSec, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.